In the heart of medieval Europe, shadows grew long, not only from castles and cathedrals, but from fear itself. Whispers of witches spread through villages. Were they midwives and healers, or servants of the devil? From secret pagan rites like Samhain to the terrifying witch trials that drowned thousands in blood, this is the untold story of medieval witchcraft. A story of myths, secrets, and the dark heart of Europe. But to understand the witch hunts and the myths that haunted medieval Europe, we must first step into the world that created them, a world both devout and terrified. Europe in the Middle Ages was a continent dominated by the Catholic Church. Its cathedrals pierced the skies, its bells marked the rhythm of daily life, and its priests declared what was holy and what was heresy. The Church was more than just a faith. It was the ultimate authority, a power greater than kings, reaching into the very thoughts of men and women. But beneath this towering presence, older traditions refused to die. In the countryside, far from the gaze of bishops and inquisitors, people still whispered to the spirits of the land. Celtic echoes lingered in Ireland and Scotland. Norse rites survived in Scandinavia, and Slavic charms were woven into daily life in Eastern Europe. These were not seen as witchcraft yet. They were part of the rhythm of survival, a charm against sickness, a ritual for the harvest, an offering to keep wolves away. But to the Church, these ancient survivals were dangerous reminders of a pagan past, sparks that could ignite rebellion against Christian order. And then there was fear. Medieval Europe was not a place of peace. Famine stalked villages, plagues swept across cities, and war ravaged kingdoms. Every shadow seemed alive with threat. Crops failed, livestock sickened, storms destroyed entire harvests, and the question always arose, why? In an age where science was unknown, explanations turned supernatural. Someone had cursed the fields. Someone had called down the storm. Someone was in league with powers unseen. It was in this crucible of a church guarding its power, of old pagan rites that never vanished, and of a society desperate for scapegoats, that the legend of the medieval witch was born. Yet beneath the shadow of the church's cross, the old gods still whispered, carried in the rituals of the people, hidden in festivals, and kept alive in the silence of the night. One of the most enduring of these traditions was Samhain, the Celtic festival that marked the death of summer and the coming of the dark half of the year. Celebrated at the turning of October into November, Samhain was not merely a harvest feast. It was a night when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. Fires blazed on hilltops, meant to drive back spirits wandering in the cold. Families left offerings of food at their doors, hoping to appease ancestors or ward off darker entities that prowled in the shadows. It was a night of divination, too. Young men and women cast charms into the fire, seeking visions of their future, of love, of marriage, of life yet to come. The air itself seemed charged, filled with the possibility of messages from the other world. In the Christian imagination, however, such practices blurred dangerously close to sorcery. And Samhain was not alone. Across Europe, echoes of pagan rites clung stubbornly to the seasons. In the Germanic lands, the Yule fires burned at midwinter, warding off the wolves of the dark. In Slavic regions, midsummer rituals called Kupala Night honored fire and water, fertility and passion. In Scandinavia, sacrifices to Odin and Frey still lingered in folk memory, though veiled beneath Christian prayers. These were not wicked acts to those who practiced them. They were the very heartbeat of rural life, binding people to the cycles of earth and sky. But the Church could not allow this duality. To the bishops and inquisitors, every pagan ember was a spark of rebellion. And so the strategy became clear. Redefine these festivals not as harmless customs, but as works of the devil. Bonfires of Samhain were recast as diabolic gatherings. Ancestor offerings were declared demon worship. Even divination, once a playful glance into the unknown, was condemned as consorting with spirits of hell. This reinterpretation was powerful. It turned the memory of gods and ancestors into whispers of witchcraft. And slowly, fear began to twist what were once sacred nights of community and remembrance into forbidden rites of darkness. It is here, in the tension between the sacred and the profane, between folk survival and religious condemnation, that the first threads of the witch myth were spun.
While festivals like Samhain carried the memory of the old gods, witchcraft in medieval Europe was not always found in bonfires and secret rites. More often, it was hidden in the cottages of villagers, whispered in remedies, charms, and everyday acts of survival. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh, uncertain, and fragile. A simple fever could claim a child. A poor harvest could doom an entire village. In such a world, healing knowledge was power, and many who possessed it were women, midwives, herbalists, wise women who knew which roots soothed pain, which plants cured fevers, which leaves could help a birth or prevent it. To their communities, these women were indispensable. They delivered children, mended bones, and offered remedies long before physicians, trained in distant universities, ever appeared in rural life. But their knowledge also made them vulnerable. For when remedies failed, when a patient died, or when illness spread despite their efforts, suspicion fell quickly. Were they healers or witches who wielded both cure and curse? And it was not only healing. Everyday people leaned on protective magic to keep misfortune at bay. Amulets of bone or carved wood hung around the neck, a small pouch of salt scattered across the threshold, iron nails hammered into door frames to ward off spirits. Even the Christian cross itself was used not only as a symbol of faith, but as a protective charm, merging folk superstition with religious belief. Love, too, was touched by magic. The lonely and desperate sought love potions brewed from herbs, honey, or drops of blood. Fertility charms were whispered over barren couples. Farmers prayed, chanted, or cast spells to protect their crops from blight, or to summon rain in times of drought. Weather magic, the power to call or calm storms, became one of the most feared accusations of all. For when lightning struck a church steeple or floods destroyed the fields, suspicion always looked for a human hand behind the storm. But the line between what was tolerated and what was forbidden was thin, dangerously thin. A charm carved with a cross might be seen as pious, but one carved with a strange rune was heretical. A midwife who saved lives was praised until the day her patient died, and then she was whispered about as a witch. A spell for love might be harmless gossip in one village and a sign of devilish sorcery in another. It was here, in this fragile space between acceptable superstition and condemned sorcery, that countless ordinary men and women lived their lives. They did not see themselves as witches. They were mothers, fathers, neighbors, trying to survive in a world filled with uncertainty. Yet their simple acts, their herbs, their charms, their whispered prayers could, under the wrong eyes, become the very evidence that would drag them before an inquisitor's court. And so, everyday magic, once a lifeline of survival, became the tinderbox upon which the great fire of witch persecutions would soon ignite.
And yet, it was not the villagers themselves who first defined witchcraft as evil. It was the Church, the great authority of medieval Europe, that took the whispers of folk magic and recast them as weapons of the devil. For centuries, the Church's stance on witchcraft was ambivalent. In the 10th century, the famous text known as the Canon Episcopi declared that women who claimed to fly at night with spirits or goddesses were merely deceived by illusions of the devil. In other words, witches had no true power. Their flights and spells were dreams, delusions, or lies. But this denial carried a hidden danger. By insisting that such practices were fantasies of the devil, the Canon Episcopi nonetheless planted the seed that witches were bound up with satanic deception. For a time, this view kept witchcraft from being treated as a widespread, organized threat. Local superstitions remained, but the Church saw them as foolish rather than fatal. Yet the winds of Europe were shifting. By the 13th century, the papacy had launched the Inquisition, a ruthless machinery designed to root out heresy. Heretics, those who challenged or resisted the authority of the Church, were now the greatest enemy of Christendom. And in the eyes of inquisitors, witchcraft was no longer a mere delusion. It was heresy itself, a secret pact with Satan, a rival faith hiding in the shadows. This shift was monumental. Where once folk healers had been tolerated or ignored, now they could be branded servants of the devil. Where a charm was a harmless superstition, now it could be reimagined as a satanic invocation. The Inquisition turned witchcraft from scattered superstition into a systematic crime against God. By the 15th century, this fear reached its terrible climax. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Effectibus. In chilling words, it declared that witches were real, that they consorted with demons, that they cursed crops, killed infants, and desecrated the faith itself. This was not merely a theological opinion, it was a declaration of war. With papal authority, inquisitors were given free rein to hunt, torture, and execute those accused of witchcraft. From this moment onward, witchcraft was no longer just a suspicion whispered in villages. It became a formal crime of the Church, punishable by fire.
The machinery of persecution had been built, and it would soon claim tens of thousands of lives across Europe.
The age of fear had begun, and the witch would soon become the most hunted figure in medieval history.
But declaring witchcraft a crime was only the beginning. To hunt witches, the Church needed to define them, to give Europe an enemy so vivid, so terrifying, that fear itself would do half the work. And thus was born one of the darkest myths of all, the witch as a servant of Satan. The devil's pact became the cornerstone of this image, where once the wise woman had been seen as a healer or the folk magician as a superstitious fool. Now both were cast as traitors to God, men and women who had willingly sold their souls in exchange for power. According to inquisitors, witches swore allegiance to Satan himself, renouncing baptism, spitting upon the cross, and signing their names in blood. This pact transformed witchcraft from a superstition into heresy of the highest order, a direct rebellion against heaven. And with this new identity came tales of the witch's Sabbat, a grotesque invention of church propaganda. In darkened forests and abandoned ruins, witches were said to gather at midnight. There, they feasted on the flesh of children, desecrated holy objects, and engaged in orgies presided over by the devil in the form of a black goat.
Sacrifices, chanting, dancing around fires, these became the lurid visions painted by demonologists. Few peasants had ever seen such things, but in sermons, pamphlets, and inquisitorial manuals, the Sabbat became proof that witches were not isolated individuals, but part of a vast satanic conspiracy. Even the idea of witches flying to these gatherings was shaped by fear and imagination. In truth, some folk healers experimented with herbal salves and ointments made from plants like belladonna, henbane, and datura, powerful hallucinogens that could induce visions of flight, transformation, or otherworldly journeys. Applied to the skin with sticks or staffs, these flying ointments may have inspired the tale of witches mounting broomsticks to soar through the night sky. What began as trance and dream became, in the eyes of the church, literal proof of demonic transportation. This new mythology was codified and spread through demonology texts, grim manuals written by theologians, inquisitors, and scholars of the occult. They described in detail how witches made their pacts, what rituals they performed, and how to identify and punish them. Among the most infamous was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, which became the Inquisitor's handbook for centuries. Its pages dripped with accusations of infanticide, cannibalism, blasphemy, and sexual perversion, imagery so vivid that it etched itself into Europe's collective imagination. Through these texts, sermons, and trials, a uniform image of the witch was born. The haggard crone with her black cat, the broomstick, the cauldron, the secret midnight gathering. An image so powerful that it still haunts us today, more enduring, perhaps, than the very faith that created it. And with this image fixed in the minds of kings and peasants alike, the stage was set for Europe's greatest purge, the witch trials that would turn fear into fire and suspicion into mass executions. And once the witch had been imagined, Europe began to see her everywhere. In forests and villages, in sickbeds and storms, fear transformed into accusation, and accusation soon became death. By the 14th century, witch hunting erupted with new ferocity. The continent had been shaken to its core by catastrophe. The Black Death swept across Europe, killing nearly half its population. Entire towns were left in ruins, fields abandoned, children orphaned. In the chaos, people desperately searched for answers and for someone to blame. Who had poisoned the wells? Who had called the plague? Who had brought God's wrath upon Christendom? Again and again, suspicion fell on the same figures: the healers, the midwives, the outsiders, the witches. The machinery of persecution grew swift and merciless. Inquisitors demanded confessions, and torture was their weapon. Victims were stretched on the rack, burned with irons, crushed beneath weights, or subjected to the swimming test, where the accused were cast into water. If they floated, it was proof they had rejected baptism and belonged to the devil. If they drowned, they were innocent, but dead all the same. Under such agony, men and women confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the night, summoning storms, coupling with demons. Their words, torn from them by pain, became evidence that fueled the fire. Executions followed swiftly. Some were hanged. Many were burned alive. Public spectacles meant to terrify the crowd as much as punish the accused. The flames were not just punishment, but a warning. This is the price of dealing with the devil. There were trials that shook kingdoms. The most famous was Joan of Arc, the teenage girl who claimed visions from God and led France to victories against the English. To her followers, she was a saint. To her enemies, a witch. In 1431, she was condemned by an ecclesiastical court, accused of heresy and sorcery, and burned at the stake in Rouen. Though later declared innocent and canonized as a saint, her death showed how thin the line was between divine inspiration and diabolic possession. But Joan was only one name among tens of thousands. In the German states, whole villages were purged in waves of hysteria. In France, trials consumed communities. In England and Scotland, witchcraft became a crime punishable by death, leading to notorious hunts, such as those driven by Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general. The hysteria spread like wildfire, crossing borders and centuries. And always, one question echoes: why were most of the victims women? The answer lies in both fear and power. In a patriarchal society, women, especially those who lived outside male control, were viewed with suspicion. Widows who owned property, midwives who held secret knowledge, the poor who begged for bread, even outspoken wives, all could become easy targets. A woman who did not fit neatly into her role could be branded a witch. In truth, the trials were not only about religion or superstition, they were also about control. Fear of the devil masked a deeper fear of women's independence, knowledge, and power. Thus, the witch became Europe's eternal scapegoat, blamed for plague, famine, storms, miscarriages, deaths of livestock, and the failings of men themselves. And as fire consumed her body, the myth of the witch only grew stronger, fed by every scream, every confession, every trial. By the late medieval ages, the witch was no longer just a figure of superstition. She was the most hunted enemy of Christendom, a shadow burned into the soul of Europe.
And yet, behind the trials and the flames, something older still lingered. Myths, symbols, and stories whispered in the dark, weaving the witch into a figure both feared and strangely fascinating. One of the most enduring images was that of the familiar spirit. To inquisitors, familiars were demons in disguise, bound to serve the witch. To villagers, however, they were often no more than beloved animals. A black cat slinking through the night became an omen of sorcery. A toad hidden in a basket was said to suckle from a witch's blood as payment for its service. Ravens and crows, scavengers of the battlefield and graveyard, became messengers between worlds. These creatures were seen not just as pets, but as supernatural companions, a witch's silent allies, watching and listening when no one else could. But folklore went further still. In countless villages, tales spoke of witches with the power to shapeshift. By day, they were ordinary women, but by night, they took the form of a wolf prowling the forest, a hare slipping through fields, or an owl crying out in the darkness. In the superstitions of the people, such creatures were never what they seemed. If a wolf limped away from a trap and the next day a woman was seen with a wounded leg, the conclusion was obvious. She was the witch who had worn the beast's skin. Fear also lived in the power of words and gestures, the dreaded curse. A glance from an old woman, a muttered phrase, or even a raised hand could be enough for neighbors to believe misfortune had been placed upon them. If a cow sickened, a child wasted away, or a marriage soured, whispers of the evil eye spread quickly. Against this terror, villagers armed themselves with counter-magic. Herbs hung in doorways, iron nails driven into thresholds, prayers mixed with charms, and sacred symbols etched on walls. In their desperation, people lived in a world where invisible battles were fought every day.
Curses cast, protections raised, unseen forces clashing all around them. And beneath all of this, hidden, quiet, but never fully extinguished, were the remnants of pagan cults. Though the church had long declared the old gods dead, their shadows lived on in secret gatherings. In lonely groves and forgotten hills, rituals honoring nature, fertility, and the cycles of the seasons survived in fragments. These were not the vast, organized cults described in inquisitors' manuals, but scattered embers of belief. To the church, even a whisper of such rites was proof of Satan's work. To the people, they were memories of ancestors, of harvests, of a world before crosses and cathedrals. And it was in these myths and secrets, familiars, shapeshifters, curses, and hidden rites that the witch became something more than human. She became the embodiment of every fear and every mystery that medieval Europe could not explain. A symbol of darkness, yes, but also of forbidden knowledge, of the untamed forces of nature, of powers that could not be caged by the church's authority. And so, as thousands were executed, the legend of the witch only grew richer, for myths, unlike flesh, cannot be burned away. They survive in whispers, in stories, in the secret corners of the night.
And yet, no age of terror lasts forever. Even in the heart of darkness, cracks began to form, and doubt crept in. By the late Middle Ages, not everyone was convinced that witches truly prowled the night. Some scholars, philosophers, and even churchmen began to whisper a dangerous thought. What if witchcraft was nothing more than imagination? Writers like the physician Johann Wehr in the 16th century argued that many of those accused were not servants of Satan, but rather the sick, the delusional, or the vulnerable. Their confessions, extracted under brutal torture, were hardly proof of real sorcery. Others suggested that stories of flying, shape-shifting, and secret Sabbaths were born of dreams, hallucinations, or illusions, the fragile tricks of the human mind under stress. At the same time, a new force was rising across Europe, the spirit of the Renaissance and humanism. Curiosity replaced fear. Observation challenged superstition. Scholars turned away from demonology and toward the natural world. Alchemists pushed boundaries. Physicians studied the body, and astronomers mapped the stars, not as portents of magic, but as celestial mechanics. Slowly, the idea that every misfortune was caused by witches gave way to explanations rooted in science, medicine, and rational thought. Printing presses spread new knowledge faster than ever before. With each book, each essay, and each challenge to superstition, the foundations of the witch hunts weakened. Still, the old fears did not vanish overnight. Villagers clung to their stories. Courts still punished the accused. But a cultural shift had begun, one that would not be easily reversed. And here lies the irony. Even as skepticism spread, it created a paradox. By questioning witches, scholars, theologians, and philosophers also gave the idea more visibility, fueling debate and controversy. The legacy of witchcraft endured, carried forward into the early modern period, where the persecutions did not disappear, but instead reached their most explosive peak. The stage was set. The fear of witches would not fade quietly. It would erupt into an age of frenzy, the great witch craze of early modern Europe.
And so, from whispered rumors and lonely villages to the roar of church trials and pyres, the story of witchcraft in medieval Europe comes to a close. It was never just about witches. It was about fear, about power, about the human need to explain the unexplainable. The Europe of the Middle Ages forged the image we still know today: the crone by the fire, the secret midnight gathering, the whispered pact in the dark. A figure cloaked in myth, fire, and secrecy. But here's the question I leave to you. Was it ever truly about magic, or was it always about control? Tell me what you think. Were witches real practitioners of forbidden arts, or victims of society's darkest fears? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your voice in this story. Because our journey doesn't end here. Beyond Europe, across the deserts and forests of Africa, witchcraft takes on a different face, one of spirits, healers, and powers both feared and revered. And that is where we travel next. Witchcraft in Africa, spirits, healers, and dark powers. The fire of myth never dies, it only changes shape.